This event is part of the Book Week Scotland 2020 Digital Festival. Book Week Scotland is a national celebration of all things reading and writing. We hope you enjoy this event. I'm Stefan Kelhofer, and I'm a bookseller with a special interest in events and working with people with disabilities and encouraging them to read more, write more, and generally interact more with the publishing world. Today, I am joined by two very talented authors, Nell Pattison and Dundas. Nell Pattison is a crime author and teacher who specialises in deaf education. Her debut novel, The Silent House, and the sequel, Silent Night, are out now. Dundas has written several short stories in addition to her debut novel, Goblin, which won the Saltire First Book Award in 2017. Sadly, Raymond Antrobus was unable to join us today. If you could both tell me a little bit more about yourselves, your writing, and what made you choose to write on this topic, please.
Who do you want to go first?
You can go first if you like.
Okay. Well, I've been writing for quite a while just because I love writing. I mean, writing is just something that I've always done in my spare time. I was an English teacher before I was a teacher of the deaf. I've always loved books and words and writing. And I think I first started writing novels in about 2010, but I started writing young adult sci-fi type novels. But I never really got anywhere with those. I think I had a lot of feedback from agents and publishers that they liked the way I wrote, they just didn't like the stories I was writing. But the most interest I got actually was when I'd written a deaf character. And somebody said to me at the time, why don't you write more about deaf characters when you are kind of heavily involved with the deaf community? And I said, well, sometimes I feel like writers who just write about their own job, I feel a bit like it's cheating. And then, somebody told me that was absolute rubbish. So I think I went away and I thought for a while, and I thought about my own writing, and I realized that what I read most was crime, and that was when I switched to writing crime. So my novels, I should explain, the Silent House and Silent Night, they're part of a series that focus on a BSL interpreter called Paige Northwood, who works with the police. So in the Silent House, she's brought in when a deaf child is murdered, and they're murdered in the middle of the night in their own house, and the family are deaf, and so obviously didn't hear anybody coming into the house. And so you've got the shocking nature of the crime connected with the fact that somebody was essentially using their deafness for their own ends. And then in Silent Night, she is involved when a student goes missing from a school for the deaf. So I thought about what I wanted to write in terms of crime, and I thought about having the deaf community aspect, because there are so few novels that actually focus on the deaf as a community, and instead of having just one singular deaf character, having a range of deaf characters. And so I wanted to write something that had more of a range of deaf characters. And I say that it is not just one deaf character who exists on their own, completely independent of any other relation to it, to deafness or to any sort of community, which is how some deaf people live and experience their life, but it's not the experience that I had. I should say myself as well, I am hard of hearing myself. It's something I was born hearing, but have lost my hearing through my late 20s and into my 30s, and that's something that an experience that I kind of wanted to investigate a bit more in fiction myself as well. So that's kind of connected.
Thank you. And Ever?
Well, I'm Ever Dundas, and I'm a queer Crip writer living in Edinburgh. And I've got ME and fibromyalgia. And the main symptoms are post-exertional malaise, cognitive pain, chronic pain, cognitive difficulties, and a kind of crushing flu-like exhaustion. So yeah, a whole bundle of fun. And I've been a writer since I was a kid, but didn't kind of properly pursue it until around 10 years ago, when I did an MA in creative writing. And that's when I started writing my first novel, Goblin, which came out in 2017. And as you said, won the Saltire First Book Award, which was a real boost. That was brilliant. And Goblin is about a little girl living in World War II London, and she witnesses the Pet Massacre, which at the time I was researching was quite a little known event that happened in London just after war was declared. So I wanted to write about this as I thought it was an important part of our history, though thankfully it's a bit better known now. There are aspects of disability in Goblin, but now with my second novel, Hell Sands, which I'm in the middle of editing at the moment, disability is very much at its core. And in this, it's a sci-fi thriller, Hell Sands, and in this fictional world, Hell Sands is a ubiquitous typeface that everybody uses. And it's the majority of the population, when they see this typeface, they experience a kind of bliss. But there's a group of people who are allergic to the typeface, and they're called deviants, and they're stigmatized. So it's basically like a really unsubtle metaphor for capitalism, or kind of living as a disabled person in capitalism. And it kind of, even though the world is completely fictional and, you know, it's a sci-fi set in a fictional future, it's inspired by my own experience. I fell ill with ME in my early 20s, and with fibromyalgia around 10 years ago, and I'm 41 just now. So I've been ill for a long time, and when I fell ill with fibromyalgia, I was working part-time, and I managed to kind of hang on to my job for a few years, but it was really tough. And eventually it was making me more ill. So I eventually had to give up my job. And of course it was then that, I mean, I already hate the Tories and I was already an anti-capitalist, but like this really rammed it home, you know, because I fell through the cracks of the capitalist system, which a lot of people experience. And I had to, you know, go through the horrendous and humiliating experience that is the Tory benefit system. It's pretty well documented how bad that is. Although not a lot of people really paid attention. You know, disabled people have been talking about this for a long time. But I think now, in light of the pandemic, a lot of people are suddenly in the same boat and are kind of shocked at how bad the system is, even though we've been telling them for a long time. So Hell Sands is kind of inspired by my own experience and by other disabled people's experience under a Tory government in a capitalist system. And I just wanted to add as well, because recently, in light of the pandemic, I've noticed a few people in the literary world saying that because we're suddenly living in a dystopia, that we don't need any dystopian narratives. So 2 problems with this. The first one being, you know, we were already living in a dystopia, you know, it's just now suddenly affecting you. Honestly, it is so condescending. It makes me so angry. I mean, the Tory government were investigated by the UN for human rights violations against disabled people. You know, we were already in a dystopia. So, you know, I think that should have been headline news, and it wasn't. It should have been like a massive scandal, and it wasn't. So it kind of shows how much our society cares about disabled people. And secondly, I'm all for escapism. We all need escapism, definitely, and definitely in times like this, but it's not either or. And again, we also need utopias, that's great, but also it's not either or. So don't bin dystopias, they're important. And you would be losing important voices if you did that. We need them. So I just kind of wanted to get that off my chest.
No, it's a very good point. I think now more than ever we need, especially if the media isn't telling the stories of disabled people, it leaves it up to people who have the ability to write and communicate these stories to sort of let people know what's happening. So I think you've made a really strong point there.
I think, sorry, just what you said about the media there, I think it's not just that the media aren't telling the stories, it's that they're twisting everything, and the media idea of disabled people as benefits grounders has been going on for so long, and I think that it also has a massive part to play and is a massive thing to blame for the people who are fortunate enough not to have experienced disability or not to have anyone in their lives who's disabled, who've never experienced that, as you're saying, ever, with the people who are like, oh, suddenly we're in a dystopia, because it's never affected their lives before.
Exactly.
If they have the media telling them that these people, oh yeah, they're not really disabled, they can get off their asses and get a job, then a lot of them are going to believe it. And I think this is a major thing that does need addressing.
Definitely.
So the theme for Book Week Scotland is looking at the future, but first I thought we'd sort of look back and see what has writing disabilities in fiction looked like until now. What sort of led us up to this point?
It's been terrible on the whole. I mean, particularly if ableds are writing the narratives, which it does tend to be ableds writing narratives about us, and they always get it wrong. I kind of just wanted to cover a kind of what I see as the 4 main sort of damaging tropes that mostly ableds kind of write. There's a lot more tropes than that, but that's just kind of the 4 main tropes. And I think the first one is inspiration porn. Basically, that disabled people can kind of overcome their disability through sheer force of will. And again, this is a kind of individualist capitalist narrative that we're buying into. And it's a kind of abled fantasy. And just to show as well that, if this is happening in fiction, it also has an impact on real life. I think that's important to emphasize that. And I've actually had experience of that myself when a journalist was interviewing me. He was a really nice guy, actually, but I think he just, like a lot of people buy into these narratives. So he asked me, he said, what are you going to do to overcome your chronic illnesses to pursue a writing career? And I was like, well, how am I supposed to overcome 2 incurable chronic illnesses, like on my own? Like, how am I supposed to do that? I need a cure. It's not me that needs to come up with that. It was just baffling. So that's kind of, everyone's enthralled to this overcoming narrative, but what I do on a day-to-day basis is more managing my illnesses, which isn't sexy, but it's the real narrative. That's the way it is. I'm not overcoming anything. And secondly, why should I have to overcome these illnesses to pursue a writing career? I mean, that's pretty damning. I think the industry should be accessible. I shouldn't have to overcome my illnesses to be able to be a writer. So I just wanted to emphasize that these fictional narratives have an effect on daily life. I think that's really important. And the second one, I think, is that we're positioned as burdens who are better off dead. The better off dead narrative is a really strong one, and it's pretty, again, that's played out in real life, and we saw that during the pandemic. Nell, I'm sure you noticed, like particularly at the beginning of lockdown, there was a lot of people saying horrendous things like, oh, this isn't going to affect us, it's just going to kill the elderly and the disabled.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, absolutely shocking. Yeah.
Terrible. How are we supposed to feel about that? It's like, I'm quite happy being alive. Thank you. I want to live. It's just, we're seen as expendable. So thirdly, often the disabled people is positioned as the villain in a narrative. And usually when this happens, it's through a sort of easy, obvious kind of physical disability, say scars, or they have a limp or something, something that's seen to be symbolic of their evilness. And often it's not even a sort of the big dichotomy of good versus evil, but sometimes that, say, a scar or whatever is supposed to symbolize weakness, and not just physical weakness, but character weakness, moral weakness. So that's a trope, and we still get that. We've had it as recent as the Wonder Woman film, where the villain was scarred, and the kind of opposite kind of Amazonian hero, you know. So it's a really old trope, and it's still happening.
I think there's an element of ugliness in that as well, isn't there? The fact that disability or chronic illness or something like that is something ugly, something that you don't want to look at, something you want to avert your eyes from. And I think that plays into that narrative just as much, doesn't it? Yeah.
Oh, definitely. And I think a lot of people with like facial scars and so on must get some horrendous stigma, and we really need to do away with that narrative. It's horrible.
Absolutely.
And finally, the kind of last one I wanted to mention was the saint or the good disabled. And this is usually when a disabled person is positioned as being made holy by their disability and by their suffering. And they usually have to suffer in silence and be stoic. And it also ties into the better off dead narrative, because usually they suffer and then they die. And ableds are left feeling good about themselves because of this inspirational disabled person. So they're kind of the four main, what I think are the four main ones, but there's a hell of a lot more. And there was recently a really great Twitter thread a few months ago, kind of going through a lot of the major really bad harmful tropes. So after this event airs, I'll post it on my Twitter at Dundas. And you can have a look at that. It's a really useful resource of kind of tropes to avoid.
I think with when it comes to deafness as well, the biggest trope is a slightly different one. Is the kind of the magic deaf, or you know, sometimes I've seen it called the magic cripple. That I think that one quite often gets applied to deaf characters. That the deaf characters are there to have some sort of special talent because they're deaf. That means that they can see extra better, or they can lip read. This is one that I often mention in articles and things. My real bugbear with deaf characters is when they can lip read a conversation from grainy CCTV footage. I mean, lip reading is one of those things that you have to know the language that people are speaking. You have to know the context. People have to be facing you. They have to, I mean, there are all sorts of things that can make people harder to lip read. I mean, facial piercings, facial hair, the position people are speaking in, the lighting, all these things make it harder to lip read. And yet suddenly, here's a deaf person we brought in to this TV show just to make them lip read something. And, you know, it's as if, they have this magic talent that somehow takes away from their deafness, and that's their only purpose. And I think that happens a lot with deaf characters. And there's one deaf character that always bothered me, which is Nick in The Stand by Stephen King, who he has no access to language or communication until he's like 12, 13, and then somebody teaches him to read and write, and then suddenly he can read and write fluently. And that takes away from the experience of deaf people for learning language, that the real hard work it is to learn language when you're living in a hearing world, and whether that is a sign language or whether it is a spoken language, there's a critical period for language learning. And if you don't have access to language until you're a certain age, there are plenty of studies on feral children and children who have been locked up and things like that, who've had no access to language until later on in their childhood, and they never develop fluent language because they've not had that aspect. And so suddenly it's just used as a narrative device, and without any attention paid to what the actual experience for that person, a person in that situation, would have been. And I think that it can be really harmful, because it gives people a completely skewed view of what it would be like to be in that situation. And I think if we really want to be creating greater understanding of disability, and I'm including deafness in that. Now, deafness is one thing that obviously some deaf people consider it a cultural difference rather than a disability, but for the purposes of this I will refer to it as a disability, simply because the majority of us are living in a hearing world. Anyway, where was I? Lost my thread there. What was I saying?
So we're just looking at sort of disabilities in fiction and how they've been represented.
Of course, yeah. So so if what we want is to create a greater understanding and greater inclusivity of disabilities. So in that, they need to be written in a way that helps people to understand
Yeah.
more about that person. I don't think that narratives about disability and about disabled characters should be purely about their disability, because, you know, as disabled people are people. They have very rich lives. All people have rich lives, have rich life experiences beyond a disability, but also we need to be able to create that understanding amongst people who've never had that experience, I think. But it needs to be accurate. It needs to be we don't want to be giving people false ideas of what it is like to be disabled or to be deaf. Does that make sense?
I think that ties into what Ever was saying as well, about as if there's this magical cure that people just need to try a little harder, and you know, you can miss the window for what language acquisition, but if, you know, someone puts a bit of effort in, you'll magically overcome all of your difficulties. And I do agree with you both that it's that idea that it's just effort, and it's hugely romanticized in often quite negative ways. I think the one that always sticks with me is being told as a kid that Robert Louis Stevenson wasn't very well and he wrote his books. And I remember seeing a picture of him sort of lounging by a window writing. And I think if someone was, you know, had a disability in that era, it's very unlikely he was, you know, just basically taking time off to write, as that kind of presentation that was given to it. And yeah, I think it's very problematic in a lot of fiction I've read that people with disabilities are presented as so many of the sort of either needlessly negative or needlessly positive ways, and it dehumanizes people. That sort of leads into my next question of are all disabilities represented equally, or are there disabilities that we just simply aren't aware of in fiction?
I think there's probably plenty that we're not aware of in fiction. I mean, there are probably things that I'm not aware of myself in my day-to-day life. I suppose you don't know what you don't know. And certainly disability is underrepresented in fiction and has been for a long time, and hopefully that's something we're gonna change. I think children's fiction is currently doing better than adult fiction at the moment for representation, but you know, I still think there is a long way to go in making these books more accessible and more mainstream, to make sure that they are read as widely as possible. I think that there are probably some disabilities, I think, that lend themselves more to narrative fiction historically, because of the tropes, and that is the thing that we need to tackle. As you say, the deafness is one that has been used. You know, people think, oh, how can I make this character? Oh, I know, I'll make them deaf, or oh, I know, I'll make them blind, and something like that. I think, you know, making that into a narrative device, I think, can give people, that makes it something different, but also makes it more interesting. But there are some disabilities that I think people probably haven't written about because they don't find them interesting, and that's what we need to tackle. That every person's experience should be interesting to other people on some level, if you want to have that sort of empathy and interconnectedness that we ultimately would like in society. So I think, yeah, there is certainly as I say, some disabilities that are better represented, and it's yeah, as I say, you don't know what you don't know. I think there are certainly a lot of avenues to still be investigated.
Yeah, I agree. I think if able authors just kind of see disabilities as a narrative device, yeah, it's not healthy. That's not how it should be. We're not a narrative device. And I think the question as well, which we've kind of covered by talking about the tropes, is, you know, are they well represented? You know, rather than just are they represented, are they well represented? And again, that goes back to the tropes and what's the damaging tropes. Yeah.
I read an interesting article recently by Shashana Stone, who is a deaf actor in the United States, about Deaf U, which is the Netflix show about Gallaudet University for the deaf in the States. And one thing that stuck with me is how she was saying, why should one representation of a community or a disability be expected to deliver everything about that disability. You know, why? Because people had complained saying, oh, well, it didn't show this, it didn't show that, or that's not my experience of deafness, or this is, you know, this. Well, why should it be? Nobody looks at The Sopranos and says, you know, oh, all white men are gangsters. You know, oh, why is it, you know, because there are so many different fictional representations of white men that one doesn't have to represent all white men, and everyone just knows that automatically. So why does one representation of a disability have to encompass all people with that disability? It doesn't. And people seem to lay that kind of pressure on a writer who's writing about a character with a disability. Oh, well, you know, that's not this, or it's not that, or it's not the other. Well, that's because we need another writer to write about that disability from a different angle, and another and another and another. We need many different people to cover different aspects of these disabilities in order for people to understand, well, that's one representation. It doesn't have to mean everything. It doesn't have to bear that entire burden by itself. Yeah,
that's you put that really well, actually. It also
I was paraphrasing somebody else's article there. I must point out that wasn't entirely my wording, but yeah.
That leads quite well into my next question, which you both kind of talked about, is who should be writing about disability and what do they need to write it well?
Well, maybe some disabled people won't agree with me on this, but I actually think it's okay for both disabled and abled to write disability. But they just have to do it well. And as I said, don't fall into the tropes. Which are just, I'm so tired of them. Like, it's so boring. It's also bad writing, you know? I mean, even forgetting the politics of it, it's just bad cliched writing. So don't do
lazy.
it.
It's lazy.
Yeah, it's very lazy. So yeah, I think both abled and disabled people should write it. And I also need to point out that some disabled people can be ableist themselves, either through internal ableism or directed outwards, or, you know, towards people with different disabilities from themselves. So we need to keep that in mind as well. So disabled people also need to do better. But generally, I think obviously disabled people are a bit more canny and from their life experience and what they've been through are less likely to be ableist than abled. And we haven't had much of a chance yet to really have a voice. So I think while abled, it's fine if they write disability. I think we do need to push for more kind of disabled voices out there, definitely.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's anyone who is a good writer and who is actually going to put the effort in to write a character well and write a rich, deeply nuanced character, who is disabled, who just happens to be disabled, and that's one part of the facet of who they are. Absolutely. But own voices are really, really important, and I think there needs to be more of a push. And I know that there has been a big push in the last few years towards own voices, but I still think it needs a lot more weight behind it. There needs to be a lot more in order to enable disabled writers to access the things that they've not been able to access in the past, to actually be able to write their stories. And whether it is their story coming from their own experience or whether it is complete fiction, that doesn't matter. But to be able, to ensure that they are well represented within fiction, within publishing, I think that still needs a lot of work.
I mean, access is the important word, isn't it? Because I think the publishing industry still isn't very accessible at all.
Yeah.
And we need to push for that. In fact, we shouldn't have to even be pushing for it. We should just be doing it. It should be par for the course. And as well, like you said, I think to get more own voices as well, as well as having more disabled writers and being accessible for them, I think publishers need to hire disabled staff, like across the board. And particularly, I guess, disabled editors, because they'll be able to spot those damaging tropes or spot someone who's doing it well. So yeah, we need that.
It kind of comes back to your overcoming story that somebody expects you to come and overcome your illnesses, which is, it shouldn't be that way. It should be top down. From publishing, as you say, it should be top down. The publishers should be making sure that they're hiring these people, that they are making themselves more accessible. And the same for society. The thing with disability is that it can be fluid depending on the environment you're in. If you are surrounded by people who have an accessible and inclusive mindset, who then do their best to make the environment accessible and inclusive, it takes some of the pressure off you to overcome your disability, or it makes it easier to manage a disability.
Yeah, exactly.
And you become more enabled by that environment changing, and that shouldn't be the responsibility of the disabled person. It's the same with deafness. I mean, Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts in the 18th century, everybody signed because there was a high amount of hereditary deafness, and so deafness didn't disable anybody because everybody signed. And to the extent where there were anecdotal reports of people not knowing who was deaf and who was hearing within their family and set of friends, because everybody signed. And if society became a lot more adaptable, a lot more inclusive, then it would make things an awful lot easier for disabled people. And I think publishing, there are ways in which publishing can do that, to make the environment of publishing more accessible, more inclusive, and to get a more accessible, inclusive mindset as well. And I think, as you say, I think that starts with having the people there who understand it, that is their lived experience, in order to change that mindset of other people.
I think that's also been, with my experiences, making things visible and inclusive, because when I've been signing to deaf family members in public, I always get that kind of novelty response, and it's kind of, people see it and it's like they've seen it for the first time. And I think quite often people don't mean anything by staring or looking and coming over and having a chat, but it does make it quite difficult. It makes, I think, in my experience, people with disabilities more self-conscious about being seen in public. And I do think that just the absence of well-written characters with disabilities kind of means that they're the exception, and people apply these kind of stories that they know from terribly written books and movies to the sort of lived experience of people with disabilities. I was also going to ask, how do disabilities in fiction tie into representation and inclusion of other minority groups?
Yeah, well, again, it comes back to kind of own voices, I think, because, everyone can be disabled, it can affect anyone. So that means that it can have a crossover with all sorts of different identities. And say, for instance, like a trans disabled person will have a different experience from me, for instance, or a disabled woman of color will have different experiences and different outlook, and bring something different to fiction. So I think it's really important to kind of support and champion all the different voices. And yeah.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, really. I don't really have an awful lot to add to that. I mean, as you say, if you're marginalised, I think you're marginalised, and I think there's a lot of ways that kind of intersectionality between different marginalised groups, and I absolutely think that improving access and visibility for one marginalised group can then support another marginalised group, as long as people are willing to keep working that way. I think some people might kind of, I think there's an idea that some people are like, no, I'm marginalised in this way, so therefore I don't care about you. But I don't think, and that's not been my experience personally. I think people who are marginalised because of their gender or because of their sexuality, I think are just as supportive of people who are marginalised because of their skin colour or because of their disability. I think tend to kind of support each other and just say, no, can we just accept everybody, please? So
I was also going to ask, as authors who have written on or have written characters with disabilities in your work, do you find that publishers have an expectation that when you're writing in future, they expect you to write on this topic? And if you were to like pitch something that was about, you know, an able person doing kind of, for what it's worth, like a normal kind of story, if that exists, do you find that that would kind of, they'd expect this experience from you?
Yeah, there is that problem, isn't there, of being kind of pigeonholed or
Mhm.
being seen as the issues author, maybe. And I think it goes back a bit to what Nell was saying. You know, if you have a disabled character, they're seen as an issues character rather than they just happen to be disabled. I think we need more characters who happen to be disabled. You know, where the story maybe isn't particularly about their disability. And so, sorry, again, slightly distracted, but going back to your question, like I personally haven't had that yet, but I'm quite early on in my career. I mean, Goblin wasn't, while it has aspects of disability, that wasn't at the forefront. Hell Sands is probably my much more kind of my disability book. So I don't know if that would end up with me being pigeonholed or whatever. I don't know. I don't know if you've had any experience with that now.
I don't know if I've necessarily been pigeonholed. I think it has certainly been publicized as my USP, kind of deaf characters and deaf signing characters, because that's not a lot of the deaf characters in fiction you don't really get many who are signing, and you don't get a wide cast of deaf characters as you have in my novels. And that was what you were saying about characters who just happen to be disabled. That's what I'm trying to get at really with having a wide range of deaf characters, is showing that there are, you know, there are just as wide a range of deaf people as there are hearing people, and rather than just having one deaf person who is representative of all deaf people. But certainly I think I do think that there's, I worry it's possible. I have talked to my agent about it. You know, I don't want to become the deaf writer, simply because there are other things I want to write. I think at the moment I am at the beginning of my career as well. I mean, my first novel came out in March, but my publisher works pretty fast and wants me to work pretty fast. So my second novel came out middle of November. My third one's out in April next year. So we're moving quite quickly with these. But I was asked to pitch another novel that had a deaf character, but who was partly from their point of view, which will be different from what I've written already, because my novels are from a hearing person's point of view mostly. But yeah, I do worry about potentially being pigeonholed. But I think that's one of those things that I will address with, I have an excellent agent, so you know, I know that's the sort of thing that if I took it to her and said I am concerned about this, I want to write something else, that I know she would be supportive of that. So I think that's important to know, that you've got somebody on your side who would understand that point of view when you say, I don't want this to become my thing, you know, I don't want this to be my label, because I would like to write other things in the future. So you know, we'll just have to see what happens, really. And I think it's just a question of working against it. But I suppose that comes back to, it really shouldn't necessarily be my responsibility solely to work against it. And hopefully there won't be anybody who says, no, you must always write you know, you must always write deaf characters, that's what you do. But well, I'll see.
One thing I've noticed as a bookseller is, obviously when I'm putting books on shelves, I noticed that a lot of books that are good at sort of talking about disabilities and people with disabilities tend to be put into genre sections. So now your books are crime, ever your books go into the sci-fi and fantasy section. And I've sort of looking at the shelves before doing this panel, I realized that most of the books that, even poorly written characters with disabilities, like The Stand, they go into these genre sections as though they can't possibly be a story just in fiction. And do you think that that's something that needs to change in future in order to kind of change the perception of people with disabilities in fiction?
I think so, definitely. I think there's, as you say, it kind of, you know, feels like it needs to be just about that. It's difficult to write, to speak from my perspective, because I feel very firmly a crime writer, because that's everything I've always written has always had some sort of mystery element to it. And even when I was writing or attempting to write sci-fi, there was always a mystery element to it, so it was sort of sci-fi crime or whatever. So but I do think, yeah, the aim would be to have to get to the stage where we don't even have to label something as, oh, this has got a well-written disabled character in it, because we want that to be the norm, that not every book to have a disabled character, of course, but many books to have well-written disabled characters, and to be in all sections, you know, as you say, not just in genre ones.
Yeah, I don't know. I hadn't actually thought about that in terms of genre before. My first novel, Goblin, is actually, I think, more literary fiction. It has fantastical elements in it, but it's written in a way that they're kind of realist as well. I guess I'm not really keen on the magical realist label either, but and this novel is sci-fi. I think just because sci-fi is such a great genre to explore, well, dystopia for a start, but just explore lots of elements about what it means to be human. My third novel is going to be literary fiction again. That will have some disability elements that explores mental health, the third one. But yeah, I'm not sure. I hadn't really thought about the genre element before.
It's the other thing I was going to ask as well, talking about books on the shelves, are there any, could you think of a book that you think people should read that is a good portrayal of disabilities in fiction? Is there one that springs to mind, or is there just not enough out there?
I wrote an article on good, well-written deaf characters in fiction recently, actually, for Crime Reads. So I think my favourite writer who's written a deaf character recently is Emma Viskage, who's again, I read and write a lot of crime, so still within the crime genre. She's an Australian writer, and her main character is deaf, and he's fascinating, because he became deaf as a young child from meningitis, and so even as an adult carries a lot of anger, and having not dealt with the fact that he lost his hearing, and you know, he's a really complex character, and I really like the way that he's written. I identify with him in a way, because I see some of my own feelings and emotions regarding my own loss of hearing as an adult. So I think she's written a deaf character particularly well, and also within the context of an interesting story arc that has nothing to do with his deafness. So yeah, that's one of my favorites at the moment. But other disabilities, I'm not sure. It's not something I've read recently. What about you, Emma?
Yeah, there's quite a few. I just wanted to briefly mention Raymond Dundas, who was supposed to be with us today. He doesn't write fiction. His poetry is all based on his own experience, but I think it's important to highlight it. I read his collection, The Perseverance, and it's brilliant. And it explores his experience of being a deaf person of colour, and also a bit about his relationship with his father. And it's just a really brilliant collection. I really loved his subversion of the poem by Ted Hughes called Deaf School. It's an absolutely brilliant subversion. I love it. And also, if you go to Raymond's Instagram, there's a really great performance of his poem, Two Guns in the Sky, for Daniel Harris. I've watched it several times, and it's really powerful. So yeah, I am a bit of a Raymond Dundas fan geek here. He's great, so check him out. So in terms of fiction, I recently read A Kind of Spark by Elle McNichol, and that's about a young girl who's autistic, and she's campaigning for a memorial for witches or women who were accused of being witches in her village, who were murdered in her village. So she wants a memorial to them. And it also explores her relationship with her family and her experience of school and being bullied for being different. So that's brilliant. Also wanted to mention, I know this isn't novels, but I wanted to mention Birds of Paradise theatre production company. The artistic director is Robert Softley Gale, and he writes for them as well, and he's brilliant. He recently, speaking of subversion of disability tropes and subversion and satire and interrogation of these tropes, he did a play called My Left Right Foot, the musical, and it was a real smash hit at the Fringe, I think a couple of years ago, and it's a brilliant subversion of the My Left Foot film, and it's just really funny as well, really entertaining, and Robert is just brilliant. I've seen a few of his plays, and I also really loved how they have the BSL interpreter not kind of off to the side, but actually as a core part of the play itself. That was really beautiful to see. So I just hope, obviously during the pandemic, lots of theatre companies are really struggling. So I hope they kind of make it through. I just wanted to highlight them. They're brilliant.
Yeah, I was also going to ask you both how we can encourage people with disabilities to read more. In my experience of the deaf community, reading isn't necessarily a popular activity, and that's just based on my own sort of experience, and I think it is tied into a lot of difficulties deaf people have had with how they have been taught language, the lack of understanding that BSL exists as a separate language with its own syntax and structure compared to British English or American English. And how do you think we can encourage people with disabilities to sort of pick up a book and get reading?
Well, I think a lot of it comes through education and through access to books and reading in childhood. I think if you make sure that a child has access to a lot of books and has a positive experience of books and reading, then it's more likely to carry on into adulthood. And that's something that schools can do and should do. I mean, there are lots of programs to make sure we're getting books into homes as well. I mean, there's things like the Imagination Library, which is Dolly Parton's thing. I know I get those books every month for my son, but not every area in the UK signs up to that, so not everybody gets it. I don't know how much of Scotland signs up to that actually. Things like that, and just making sure that we have a wide variety of representation in children's books so that children who are disabled see themselves in books. And I think that's really important. That's really important for their development, I think, and their self-esteem as a person, but also for their interest in books, because I think if they never see themselves represented in books, then they will start to think that books aren't for them. And I think that would be such a shame if they think that books can't be something that they could be interested in because it just doesn't relate to them. So I think that's a really important thing. I mean, for adults, it is, again, it's making sure there's the representation there and making sure that they, that they can see themselves in fiction. It's what is it that puts people off? If it is a language barrier, then that's something to consider. Again, it's an education thing. How can we support people to enjoy reading? When they're in adulthood, what can we put in place within the community, within families to help people to enjoy it? It's a big societal question that I can't solve, much as I would love to. I don't think I can solve it myself, and it goes back a little bit to Eva's very well worded lambasting of our current government, but it's there are an awful lot of facets, I think, to encouraging people to read. And I think it has to, yeah, there's an awful lot of societal change that would help.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with Nell. I don't really have anything to add to that yet.
Yeah, it's I think I had a question about how well the UK and Scotland specifically are doing to represent disabilities in fiction, but I kind of feel like Ever, you covered that beautifully at the start, where fundamentally there is just so much that needs to be done. So I'm going to take the opportunity to change that question a little bit and just ask, how is the UK doing in comparison to other countries? Have you seen any particular places doing better or worse, or does it just feel like across the world there's just not enough being done?
That's actually a really good question, which I hadn't thought about before. And I actually don't know. I would really love to know a bit more about what the publishing industry is like in different countries for disabled people. So if anybody watching this has any advice or info, tweet me. That would be great. I'd love to know. I don't know if you know much, Nell.
I don't know. I think as well, part of it's because English is the only language I can read. So unless something is translated into English, it's, you know, it makes it more. It means I can't read it. So I don't know really. Yeah, that's something I don't know. Even with other English language publishing, like in America or Australia, I don't know. But it is a really interesting. I would like to know.
Yeah,
it's a really interesting question.
It's yeah, it's something I was just thinking about when we were talking there, that yeah, I wonder if there's anywhere that does it well, because I can't think of any books I've read that you know are a gold standard in terms of things written more than about 10 years ago.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is, it's possible things could be going well in other countries, but it's just, the thing is with disabilities that it's stigmatized the world over, you know?
Yeah.
We experience this discrimination everywhere. So I'm not entirely hopeful, but you never know. So yeah, I'd love to know about different experiences across the world, definitely.
So I think I've got time for one more question, which is relevant to what we're doing just now. It's that current events with COVID-19 pandemic happening have led to a growing number of events being broadcast online, such as this one. Is this helpful, or do you think this is more exclusionary to disabled people? Like, where do you think this sits as a change that we'll be seeing in the world of literary publishing?
Well, I think on the whole, it's helpful, but obviously there's going to be some people who don't have access to computers and don't have online access, and they will very much be excluded. And I think we need to change this idea that we have that these things are luxuries. And I think the pandemic has shown us that it's actually a necessity. And I don't think it's some socialist out there utopia that we can provide that to everybody. And again, it's something the Tories would hate, but it's something that we should be providing. But apart from that, I think generally, yes. I mean, I've heard from so many disabled people saying that they've been able to access events online, take part in events online that they couldn't before. And sometimes, you know, I'm friends with a lot of other kind of chronically ill people as well. I mean, they could do an event like this, and they could do it in their bed if they needed to. And, you know, even for me, this is slightly easier because I didn't have to travel anywhere, which is quite exhausting. Although having said that, I need to point out that this is still work, you know, this is still a lot of effort, and this is still exhausting. And I think a lot of people also have Zoom fatigue. So that's a very real thing. But I think it really has opened up the world to a lot of people. And I have to point out as well, like disabled people have been asking for this kind of access for a long time. And we're always just get, oh no, that's not possible. And now we've seen with the pandemic, it most definitely is possible, you know, and it was done easily and quickly. So I think, you know, this is an event about the future. So I think going into the future, we don't want to go back to normal, because normal sucked, you know, and we don't want to lose what we've gained. So I think we need to go forward with better access and maybe have things like hybrid events and things. So we don't want to lose what we've gained here, definitely.
Yeah, I agree that there has been an awful lot more accessibility in many ways, because as you say, if people couldn't afford to travel to events or to pay tickets, you know, for tickets for events that you know have become free online, then you know that aspect has been taken away. There's timing, there's personal circumstances, there's all sorts of reasons why people might not be able to attend in-person events, but they can then watch things that are broadcast online, because you know often whilst they might be broadcast at a specific time, you can usually then watch them back. It means that captions can be added, it means that sign language can be added, you know, to make things more accessible. And even for live events, most things like Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Google Meet have closed captions options. So whilst they're not perfect, no automated live captioning is ever going to be perfect. They at least help. They do at least make a difference. So I think absolutely it has increased accessibility an awful lot. But as you say, Eva, I think it has really highlighted how ignored disabled people have been when they've been asking for these adaptations, these you know, and really, I mean, the Equality Act of 2010 talks about reasonable adjustments, and there are all of these things that people have said weren't reasonable before, and now suddenly they are. That needs, I mean, I feel like a full public inquiry needs to happen into that, because it was always a reasonable adjustment. It's just that people couldn't be bothered to put the effort in. You know, people with disabilities who wanted the capacity to work from home or to work more flexible hours. And it's not just people with disabilities, it's people with young families or people who are carers who want more flexibility in their lives, who want to be able to do things virtually, if possible, rather than in person. And, you know, I think it has really highlighted how ignored so many marginalised voices have been when they've just been asking for small adaptations that will make their life easier, that will make it easier for them to do their job well, you know, because if you're not having to have, you know, an hour's commute to an event or to a meeting that might completely exhaust you or might leave you in pain or might mean you have to pay for an extra hour of childcare, you know, then it just, yeah, all of these things that, you know, these people are then going to perform better in their job. And or if there's a lot of cases with studying with universities as well where students who haven't been able to access on-campus learning have asked for virtual learning. They've been told, no, we can't do it. We don't do it that way. We can't do it that way. And then suddenly we can. So actually, you've just been excluding those people from education. And that should not happen. We should not be in a position in 2020 in a developed country where we are excluding people from education because they have a disability, because they can't travel, because they have a young family, because they have to work as well as learn. We shouldn't be doing that. And I think that is something that it has really become starkly obvious. And as you say, Eva, we can't go back to how it was. It would be an absolute travesty if we did that. We need to really wake up and think, why are we making people do things the way they were always done? Just because they're the way they were always done, that's not a good enough reason. It's not a good enough reason.
Well, yeah, thank you so much, Nell. Thank you so much, Eva. I really appreciate you both being on this panel. I'm just going to say that this Book Week Scotland event has been brought to you by Scottish Book Trust. Scottish Book Trust wants everyone living in Scotland to have equal access to books, because better access to books means better life chances. You can help by gifting a book to a family who is struggling this Christmas. If you enjoyed this event, please consider sharing your love of reading with others by making a donation to Scottish Book Trust Christmas Appeal at scottishbooktrust.com. Thank you both so much, and thank you for watching.
Thanks so much for having us, and Nell, it was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. It's been brilliant, absolutely. And I think we could carry on this conversation for another 2 hours if we had the capacity to.